Is the congregation pretty involved?
I don't know. There's actually, yeah, I'm not sure. They would know.
Okay.
Yeah. Good evening, everybody. Good to see you. So we're going to get started actually in just a few minutes. In the meantime, though, I wanted just to note, given that we have a large crowd here, which is wonderful, thanks so much for being with us, that we have an overflow room. If you want to be a little bit more comfortable and have a seat, room 202. And is it Taylor? Taylor is going to guide you there. So if you would like to go to the overflow room, follow Taylor. And we'll get started in just a few minutes. All right, hello everybody. Good evening again. And welcome to this evening's panel and community conversation. So my name is Michael Burrows, and I'm director of the Kegley Institute of Ethics here at California State University, Bakersfield. And on behalf of the Institute and the Pre-Law Society at CSU Bakersfield, I want to thank you again for joining us tonight for this event, which we titled Immigration Behind Bars, Activist, Legal, and Education Perspectives. So we organized this event, as with all of our ethics panels and these community conversations that we like to host, with the aim of bringing our community together across differences of position and place, to learn, to question, and to engage in respectful discussion on topics of import to our region and our nation. And the issues that we're talking about tonight, immigration, detention, and related issues of understanding these issues are certainly impactful ones, both for our region, but also for our country and our world. So this program that we're putting on tonight is made possible by a number of people, and it's always really important to credit those people who make this work possible and make it possible for us to come together tonight. And so I want to take a moment now just to thank a few sponsors and a few others. So first of all, for our sponsors, the Kegley family, Adventist Health and Kaiser Permanente, Kern Schools Federal Credit Union, the CSUB Institute for Religion, Education, and Public Policy, the CSUB Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Compliance, and the CSUB Office of the Provost. Thank you very much for your sponsorship tonight and supporting us. Special thanks also goes to our event co-hosts, the Pre-Law Society. So thank you very much. And this includes Dr. Janine Craybill, who's faculty advisor for the Pre-Law Society and co-organizer of this event. Mr. Micah Nielsen, the Pre-Law Committee co-chair, and our moderator this evening. And I'd also like to thank the Pre-Law Society officers and members who are present tonight helping out with the event, as well as the Pre-Law Society Committee who supported this event in a number of ways. I'd also like to thank Dean Bacon for his support throughout this process too. And last but certainly not least, I want to thank our panelists for being with us tonight and for speaking and sharing their wisdom and their insight. We have our third panelist here and our two up here, so I'll let our moderator introduce them in a moment. And with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator to do the introductions and get us started tonight. So thank you.
Thank you. So, welcome. I'm excited to be here. My name is Micah Nielsen. I'm an attorney here in town. I do not practice immigration law, so I am the fish out of water for your esteemed panelists today. That's why I'm not a panelist. I'm the moderator. The format is going to be that I will introduce the panelists. They're going to have around 12 minutes, 15 minutes to share some information with you about some specific areas about immigration detention centers and with an emphasis on juveniles, on minors. And then we're going to open up for question and answer period, and we're going to reserve a significant period of time for that. So our goal is to end by 8 o'clock, and there are question cards that you can fill out. There will be members of the Pre-Law Society that will be collecting cards. You can submit cards during the presentations. As questions rise, you can hold them in reserve. You can submit the cards, they'll bring them up to me, I'll read them, or you can use one of the live mics that will be around here. For those that are in the overflow room, the cards are available at the front. Hopefully you grab some. If not, you can still grab some cards. And I don't think we have a microphone in that room, so feel free to come into this room in the Q&A session, and you'll have an opportunity to ask your question. By way of topic introduction and why I'm here, going to law school, one of my favorite classes was constitutional law. And in part just because you get to go over the very basics of constitutional law and some of the rights that we have. And it wasn't until actually relatively recently that I realized that even as a citizen, I could be detained tonight if I was unable or refused to show documentation to law enforcement of my legal status here. It doesn't just impact immigrants. I happen to be a Canadian citizen, but I'm an American citizen now as well. But notwithstanding, it's an issue that should address all of us, not just for fear or risk of it applying to us, but because it's what's going on. And we've got these constitutional rights, and then as soon as you go into a detention center, they're gone because the rules don't apply to those detainees. There are some procedural rights, but it's such a huge area of magnificent importance. I think you understand that. That's why you're here. And so I will introduce the panelists and let them get into the topics because that's why we're here. So I'll lead off with Amber Tovar. She's the directing attorney for the Removal Defense Project at UFW Foundation here in Bakersfield. Through her work with the United Farm Workers Foundation, Ms. Tovar strives to accomplish social integration and civic participation for immigrants and their children. Prior to joining the UFW Foundation, she worked at Immigrant Defenders Law Center as a staff attorney representing Franco Gonzalez class members in removal proceedings. Amber began her journey of advocating for the rights of the immigrant community with the farm worker movement in 2004. She earned her BA from UCLA and her JD from Western State University College of Law. She is a familiar face in discussions on immigration and removal policy, having participated on numerous panels, and she's often interviewed by the news outlets. At the end, we have Jeannie Parent. She is a professor of English for multilingual students at Bakersfield College and coordinator of Kwezi, Kern Welcoming and Extending Solidarity to Immigrants. And that's a local nonprofit that she'll talk more about. And she's also a member, which is a member of Freedom for Immigrants, a national immigrant advocacy organization. As other volunteers at Kwezi, Ms. Parent regularly advocates for immigrants being held at the Mesa Verde detention facility here in Bakersfield. She also visits with them in order to end the isolation they experience and communicates with attorneys and provides post-release assistance, which includes temporarily housing asylum seekers as well as providing food, transportation, and other necessities. Ms. Parent is fluent in Swedish, Norwegian, and conversational Japanese. She has rich experiences in understanding of learning a second language in a different culture. She was a participant in the Fulbright Hays Group project in Vietnam and Cambodia in July of 2010. Her project, Connecting Cultures Through Oral Histories, involved exposing students to the culture of Vietnam through multimedia as well as interviews conducted with various Vietnamese people. And in the middle, we have Adam Sawyer. Dr. Sawyer is an assistant professor in teacher education, director of liberal studies, and coordinator for the bilingual authorization program here at Cal State University, Bakersfield. He holds a doctorate from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. His work examines the theorization, design, and impact of innovative teacher professional development programs and pedagogies responsive to the cultural and linguistic needs of immigrants, language minorities, and other historically marginalized populations, especially in Latin America and the United States. He is also a specialist on the topics of global migration, transnationalism, and displacement and their intersection with schooling. His work has been published by such outlets as International Migration Review, Teacher Education Quarterly, Migration Policy Institute, and Journal of Latinos in Education. He is co-editor of the 2013 Teachers College Press volume regarding Educación, Mexican-American schooling, immigration, and binational solutions. Previous to his academic career, Adam served as a Spanish bilingual elementary school teacher in East Palo Alto, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, and as an academic consultant to the Mexican Ministry of Education. He also previously served as a research fellow at the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at University of California, San Diego. And I will let them introduce the topics that they talk about just as by way of, as they get into it. The order that we'll follow is we'll start with Adam, and then we'll move on from there.
Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. Muy buenas noches. Thank you, Micah, for that kind introduction, and thank you for the Kegley Institute and the CSUB Pre-Law Society for the invitation and the sponsorship of this event. And it's really just an honor to be here for this important conversation and to see so many of you, standing room only. So I really appreciate that interest. So I'm going to talk, I'm going to have three main areas that I'll cover in my talking points tonight. First will be to provide some brief historical context on the history of government-sanctioned family detainment and separation. Secondly, I will try to dig a little bit into what is the context of schooling for these children who are currently detained and or separated from their parents. There's a lot we don't know, but I will try to uncover what we can there. Lastly, I will talk a little bit about the short, medium, and longer-term educational and socio-emotional implications for children of detainment and separation, as we can glean from the literature in the field of psychology and in the social sciences. One thing I should mention from the outset before we get into thinking about even the government's participation in sanctioning parent-child separation is that in many ways, separations from a primary caregiver are really come with the territory of migration for many, many children. I can speak from my experience in the southern state of Oaxaca in Mexico, a prominent migrant sending community, when I did my dissertation research. And it was very common in this community, like in many communities, that parents, often the father first, but sometimes the father and the mother, will leave, sometimes temporarily, sometimes long-term, leaving the children behind in the care of others in the migrant origin community. And from these experiences, I can tell you there were so many heartbreaking stories we collected from children and youth as to the pain involved with these separations, the uncertainty of when you were going to see mom and dad again. And certainly educators spoke to there being negative consequences for the educational achievement and experiences of these students. But domestically, this is something a little closer to home too, right? Here in a place like this is really resident in the Central Valley. Domestically, we have separations that occur because of employment. We think about an area like agriculture that relies in great measure on obviously immigrant labor, but also seasonal labor. So there are separations that occur there. In my experience as an elementary school teacher, I had many students who had long-term separations from parents due to domestic migration. Sometimes many years later, I would get stories as to how, boy, you know, in second grade, there were 6 to 9 months where my dad was away, and you were kind of like the stand-in dad during that time. And I wouldn't know this for years sometimes, that was the place. So educators, we have a lot on our shoulders when it comes to this, and kind of being responsive to what is happening. So that's just the outset before we get into where the government comes in with this. So for some historical perspective, right, detainment of immigrant families is not new in American history, right? We definitely know from historical research that at Ellis Island in New York and in Angel Island here on the West Coast that primarily served immigrants from Asia, that there's a great deal, many of examples of detainment, sometimes long-term detainment of families. The extent of parent-child separation, as far as I can see, is uncertain in the historical record, but we did have this detainment. But some of you who may be familiar with the Native American boarding school experience here in the late 19th and early 20th century would know that the government participated actively removing children from parents of indigenous families and putting them in government-run boarding schools. It had disastrous consequences, right, for these students in the long term. So that's another piece here historically that we have seen before the current crisis. So, all right, so now to the present day, right? I think that probably the first many of us heard about what was happening with the parent-child separation at the border was about last spring, May and June of last year, right? With the so-called, the publicizing of the so-called zero tolerance policy of the Trump administration of removing parents and children when they arrived instead of having them together. We know during that time, up to 2,700 children were separated from parents as part of this policy. But, as has been uncovered in recent media reports through such outlets as PBS's Frontline, recent stories in the New York Times, NPR, this was happening a good year before. We can trace these activities, these policies back to 2017. And the impact of this is really unknown. There could be thousands of children impacted by this, and we really don't know. And the extent of the reunification between children and their caregivers in the United States sometimes is limited by enforcement. We've had instances, there's been reported incidents of caretakers showing up to claim a child and then being apprehended by ICE in that process. So something that deserves further examination, but complicates this reunification. What happens with schools? So there are some protocols as to what's supposed to happen with the schooling of these students, these children who are being held in these immigrant shelters, right? And their lives do not stop. So the protocol through the Department of Health and Human Services is that within 72 hours, there is supposed to be an educational assessment provided. Okay, and this is supposed to look at academic competencies in different subject areas where the child might be linguistically, and the assessment of any learning disabilities or other things that might hinder learning at high levels. Then there's supposed to be a follow-up of 6 hours of school, including linguistic support for emergent bilinguals, right? We are thinking that most of these children, if not all, are going to be learners of English. And they're also supposed to receive services, right, for any disabilities they might have, and some opportunities for physical education. So those are those who are held in the facilities. For those who are released to a caregiver, they do have the right to public school education. There's a Supreme Court precedent, Plyer v. Doe case of 1982, that prohibits schools and school districts from discriminating on the base of immigration status, right? But sometimes there's complications with the materials. So let's return, though, for a second to those who are in these migrant holding centers or the shelters, right? So I see lots of educators in the room, and those of us in public education who have been educators know how complex an endeavor it already is. Serving newcomer immigrant students to begin with, right? With the host of complexities of serving that population in responsive ways that lead to really good schooling outcomes is really hard to do, and it's not done well in many instances, even by the best of schools and under the best of circumstances, right? It is a complex endeavor and something we're always striving to get better at. So let's move that over to what might be happening in these facilities, right, where there's so much uncertainty. We have children who are highly traumatized. Let's keep in mind, right, if they're coming from Central America, they already have had whatever experience they've had in the home country, whatever has spurred the migration, pushed the migration. Then those of you who have read Sonia Nazario's vivid work out of Mexico, there is now the migration through Mexico, which is perilous, right? And then add that to whatever is happening at the border and then the experience in the shelters. So learning does not happen at high levels when there's a high degree of trauma like this. But there's changing landscapes on top of this, right? I'm going to pile it on here. I apologize. But there's changing landscapes. Children are being moved from facility to facility, right? And on top of this, HHS has contracted out the care of these facilities to numerous contractors, some who are private and for-profit. We've heard instances of abuse and neglect. So think about, well, is schooling going to happen at high levels in these facilities? And I think we would have our doubts, right? So now I'll move over to my third area. What can social science research and psychology, and research in the field of psychology, help us to extrapolate as to what lays in store for these children in the short, medium, and longer terms? Well, it's important to note, Mary Dozier, who's a professor of child development at University of Delaware, says it's variable, right? There are some factors or predictors we might want to take into consideration here. There's length of detainment, the quality of the facility, and the previous trauma, right? Which we know could be extensive in these cases. I also want to shy away from getting into the syndrome, like a pobrecito syndrome here, where we might be dismissing the level of resilience these children are capable of. I mean, having worked as an educator in such communities for more than 2 decades, I would never put anything past these children, right? These families, right? The potential is endless, but we are really stacking the cards in a difficult way here. Let's get into what some of these issues might be, right? We know from decades, right, probably more than 6 decades of research on parent-child attachment, that removal, all right, being separated from a primary caregiver, right, depending on the length of that separation, can increase the risk for such issues as anxiety, depression, PTSD, ADHD, and such physical outcomes as cardiovascular disease. This is supported in the literature. So we also, though, have to take in consideration what this might also be exacerbating when we're talking about this population of children and youth, right? Those who are subsisting in an undocumented status and all of the vulnerability and uncertainty that comes with that face what has been called by Roberto Gonzalez, who is a sociologist at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, has called perpetual liminality. Okay, let me unpack this little academic concept here. But basically, a liminal space being when that transition from one milestone from another. So think about turning in from a high school student to a college student, or a college student to a college graduate, right? And those next stages, those next milestones in life. Well, for the undocumented, even those who might be lucky enough to get DACA, right, because of the uncertainties around DACA, there is this state of suspended progress in one's life that does interrupt learning. It does interrupt total educational attainment. It does limit potential in the labor market over time, in addition to a host of other factors. So it exacerbates that. There's another concept I think is important from the academic record that was coined by the wonderful immigration team at UCLA, the husband and wife team of Marcelo and Carola Suarez Orozco. My students were in my class. We talked about this today, so you'll remember this. But there's this topic of negative social mirroring. It's how people like you are mirrored back to you, or people of your identity, your skin color, your ethnicity are mirrored back to you by the larger society, which is already a risk factor. We already see there's risk involved with that, with educational achievement of students. And this is in this context of really heated debate about the border, and probably a great stereotyping of those who are coming over. This negative social mirroring is one of these exacerbated issues to think about. So, I do want to leave with some, like a road forward here. I know this is a tough topic and it's hard to talk about, right? But probably the best case scenario here for these children and youth, and it could be thousands, right? Would be a reunification with a loving and nurturing family member as soon as possible. But we know with enforcement that is impeding that to some extent. But on top of that, being free of that fear of deportation once reunited would also lead to a stability of a situation that would help with developing this resilience that is so important. And then finally, a stable, high quality, and responsive public school education, right? This is going to be where the ticket lies as soon as possible, right? And to increase the odds of these students. I wouldn't put anything past, right, these children and youth, but it is really a difficult situation we have given them. So perhaps in our conversation, we might get a chance to talk about, well, if there's educators in the room who want to think about, well, if we have students who have undergone these experiences here in Kern County, right, what would I do? And I think that maybe it's probably a question I should leave for my students. I have several in the room who I think have an assignment due about this a little later this week. But certainly care, routine, and stability, teachers who are going to be aware of the situation and can connect students and families to resources in the community. There's things in the classroom that are really hard to handle for the training a teacher might receive around issues of trauma that are better connected and supported by connection to the larger network. But there's a host of other things, but I will stop here. I've talked long enough, and I look forward to hearing from my other wonderful panelists here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. And the panelists will have a few minutes after the Q&A to sum things up with some final remarks as well. So you do get another opportunity to address key points that you want to. So we're going to move forward, and we're going to hear from Amber now. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. As was mentioned, I am the directing attorney for the Removal Defense Project here in Bakersfield. It's something that was recently created 6 months ago. So it's nice to be back to Bakersfield, and I'm so excited that we're having these conversations, these important conversations about what people would consider a hot topic, a sexy topic, right? It's in the news, it's everywhere. But I think it's also, important to add to another layer to add to what Dr. Sawyer already explained. It's not only the trauma that these children or families are running away from, but now they come to the United States and they are confronted by a wall, right? A legal barrier, a legal lack of access. So through my discussion, I hope to touch base on just what does that immigration detention removal defense process look like? What is the legal impact that is having in some of the cases that we're seeing through our door? And also, what is the local and national impact of that, right? Because I think it's important to think not only of the work that this community is doing, but how that work can impact at the national level. So I like to sort of paint a picture of what that process looks like. So there are many people that don't know that ICE enforcement, or somebody who can be placed in removal proceedings, essentially that happens to one of three ways. One way is at the border, right? And that's what's happening now, or at least that's what the media is putting out as the main form of apprehension. But what we're also seeing is in Kern County and many areas of the states, and then also at a national level, we're seeing increased immigration enforcement. Yeah. That means ICE coming and knocking our doors, or ICE doing, I would say, illegal traffic stops. So that is one way, right? Or those are two ways. Now, the third way is something that is new, that some people would say, okay, yes, it was written in the law that this is allowed, that this is something that can be allowed, or is okay under the law to do. But this administration definitely chose to make that a priority, and that is for people who maybe are applying for an affirmative form of relief. Let's say maybe they are trying to naturalize. Maybe they are trying to seek a U visa, right? A U visa is for people who are victims of crime here in the United States, and they have cooperated with the police. Anybody who, for whatever reason, without notice, without an opportunity to even amend their application, if they are denied, they are immediately placed in removal proceedings. Right? So those are the three ways. Now, what happens once they are in removal proceedings, either at the border or locally within our community, is the majority of the time, I would say 8 times out of 10, they are sent to a detention facility, right? How many of you guys know that we actually have a detention facility in our backyard? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those that are not raising your hand, right, it's concerning, right, that we have a detention facility. It's a mile away from our office. I can literally walk there and see my clients. That has a capacity to hold over 400 individuals, 100 women, 300 men. And when you think about the geographic location of Bakersfield, right, and the fact that people who are detained at Mesa Verde have to attend hearings in San Francisco, right? So usually what happens is I show up with my file, I have a client who maybe I'm representing in their bond hearing or maybe in their main removal defense case, and we attend court through a monitor, right? So the San Francisco judge is sitting in the San Francisco bench, right, in San Francisco court, and we are having a removal defense hearing through a monitor. So talk about due process, right? And the ability to present evidence that would help your case. So the majority of people that are held in Mesa Verde are held without legal representation, right? You have, I am one of 2 attorneys, nonprofit attorneys that can do this work or are doing this work here in Kern County. And Kern County-wise, there are probably 4 or 5 immigration attorneys, one of which is taking removal defense cases, right? So the majority of people are having to travel, let's say, to Fresno County, San Francisco, to try to look for counsel to represent them, right? And then you have maybe if they are able to seek those services or at least try to make the way all the way to San Francisco to see if they can have a consult, you have the majority of attorneys who are saying, I am sorry, I cannot represent you because it's so costly for me to drive 4 or 5 hours to even meet with a client on a regular basis and try to help them prepare for their case, right? So we literally have a desert of access to legal counsel. And then something to highlight about that process is like, people ask like, well, can't they just be given an attorney, right? When we said about constitutional rights and the fact that they don't apply for immigration proceedings is the fact that you are not appointed legal counsel, right? You have the right to counsel, but the caveat there is if you can afford one, right? So the majority of people that are held in Mesa Verde do so and proceed with their hearings without any representation. And that is the case also for children, right? That you have the majority of children who are having to go through that process, again, without legal representation. Yeah. I don't know if I try to circulate this video, and I don't know if many of you have seen it, but it really just presents this picture of a judge asking a 2-year-old, right? Yeah. A 4-year-old, where are you from? And that poor child just can't even answer what his name is, right? Or what her name is, or where her parents are. And you're expecting a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old to go through the removal proceeding without legal counsel by his or her side, right? So there is some, I would say that there is hopefully some litigation that is developing, hopefully in a positive way. It has not been positive the last time it was held, that it was heard by the court. But there is some movement in providing or making sure that at least children have access to counsel. To this point, children are not appointed counsel. The only people that are appointed counsel are people who are have a mental illness, right? And that is the Franco Gonzalez litigation. And those are the only people that really can have somebody by their side. So then what happens? If you don't have access to counsel, usually the hearings within detention have to go on, right? The judge is not going to wait for you to come with an attorney. You may be set for a hearing 2 weeks later. You have another hearing. You needed to turn in some evidence. Oh, I'm so sorry. We have to move on, right? So considering the elements of detention, what that may look like in terms of access to evidence, to resources, unfortunately, under this administration, it's something that's just not considered, right? They're trying to move through cases as fast as they can and try to process as many cases as possible within a short amount of time. So people have to go through their removal proceeding at a faster pace. Those of the individuals that are detained that are lucky enough to get out of detention, and I will go through what that lucky process looks like, they are able to attend hearings in San Francisco as well, right? So then they get released. Their next court hearing is in San Francisco. So they too have to travel 4 to 5 hours, right? If they have an 8 a.m. court hearing, they're having to leave probably the night before, if not at 2 or 3 in the morning. So that process, right? And that barrier there. When I say lucky is just because today, actually, one of our clients got granted bond, and I was so excited with the fact that she was granted a $4,500 bond, right? And when I say $4,500, that's considering that she has to pay the full amount, right? It's not like criminal proceedings where you pay 10% of whatever bail amount you were given. This is the full amount, right? And I don't know about you guys, but not too many of us have $7,000, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 just saved in our bank account, right? It's a huge undertaking. So, and the reason I say that I was so excited that that happened is because I have not seen a judge in detention give a $4,500 bond. That just does not happen. And actually, that judge said on the record, I usually give $7,500 bonds for cases like yours, and but I'm going to make an exception, right? That's basically what he said, right? So then when you think of that, there are those that, yes, maybe are lucky enough to have a bond granted to them and are able to get out. Others, not so much, right? So the process of even getting out of detention, that too has changed. We had a very helpful case that would allow for people to request bond every 6 months, right? So every 6 months you had the opportunity to say, you know what, I'm still here, I have not bonded out, can you please let me out? Basically, that's what I was, just begging. And that case was taken away from us, right? So now we have people who have to fit a very specific and very narrow set of facts to even have the ability or even have the opportunity to ask for bond, much less be granted one, right? So I think here in Kern County, a little bit different from LA County where I was coming from, we're seeing huge or large amounts of bonds being set at a very high amount, right? When that judge said, I don't grant $4,500 bonds, that's very, very true. Now, the other aspect of that is clients not only have to worry, or detainees not only have to worry about, can I get out, right? But also, if I do get out, who can help me with my case, right? You know, I left Guatemala, or I left Honduras, I left El Salvador because I was persecuted by the gangs, or I was a victim of domestic violence from somebody who I was just not able to leave, right? So even those forms of relief have been really curtailed by this administration as well, right? We've seen some decisions come down by the previous Attorney General, right? And those decisions were not helpful, right? I mean, we have people who have fled serious harm who are unable to seek that proper relief because that relief is just no longer available to them. Again, that process itself, right? It's not only coming to this country and that journey of coming to this country, but also just this legal barrier, right? This access to resources. At the national level, it means that there are 800,000, over 800,000 cases that are yet to be processed by the immigration court, right? About, regarding detention numbers, we have, I think, 45,000 beds available throughout this wonderful nation. And then we have numbers where we've received that we are over capacity. So we have beds of 45,000, we're at 48,000 beds, or individuals that have been detained and have gone through that process, right? So, I mean, there's definitely a system here of making sure that people are put through the system and then not necessarily access to conclude their proceedings or a way to get out of those proceedings. So I think it's definitely a hot issue, but I think I encourage you all to also see how this issue is affecting your local community too, right? Yeah. We see all these numbers and this data available at the national level, but this is happening in our backyard. Mm-hmm. This is happening to our neighbors, to people who we come across with in church or whatever it may be, right? Your situation. Mm-hmm. And it's important to not only realize or like understand the legal concepts of that, right? But also the human side to these stories, right? And taking the time to listen, taking the time to understand how this is a local issue. It's a federal issue, but it's having serious impacts here in our community.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. The final panelist for her presentation will be Jeannie.
Hi, and thank you for having us. Thanks to the Kegley Institute and to the Pre-Law Society. I'm going to start by telling a couple of stories, and then I'll move into our organization and how you might be able to participate. A couple of weeks ago, I met a young woman from Cameroon who's part of the English-speaking minority. And right now, the French-speaking, for the past few years, the French-speaking majority in Cameroon has been persecuting those that speak English. It's 80%, 20% demographic. So she had an education. She had studied law, and she was studying for the bar exam. But they only offer it every few years. So while she was studying, she started a baking business. A customer wanted a cake that had the Ambazonian flag on it, which is the Anglophones' symbol, which she made, and for that, she was imprisoned by the French government and tortured. So fortunately, her uncle came to see her and put pressure on the guards, and I don't know if he bribed the guards or how, but he was able to get her out and get her out of the country, where she flew to Ecuador. And this is a very common journey for immigrants from Africa, is they fly to Ecuador or Brazil, because those countries don't have the same visa requirements that other countries do. And then from Ecuador, she walked through the jungles of Panama, which took 5 days, and this also is the usual route, and then continued through Central America and up through Mexico, and presented herself at a legal point of entry at the United States border. At that point, she was thrown into prison. So that's what happens to asylum seekers. Another young man from Pakistan was barely 18 when I met him. His family was Christian, and they had fled Pakistan to Saudi Arabia. That was a mistake. They were imprisoned there, and they were tortured. And so they all came to the same route, but through Brazil and up through Central America, and ended up at the U.S. border. He had 3 younger siblings, I think, 3 or 4, and his younger siblings and his mother were released and allowed to go to Pennsylvania to live with their uncle, whereas he was detained at Mesa Verde, where he turned 18, and his father was sent to Florida, so they were separated. He was there for several months before they finally released him on an ankle monitor. Why am I telling these stories? Because these are some of the thousands of stories that you can hear of people that are detained at Mesa Verde Detention Center, which, like Ambar said, it houses 400 people, and it's just downtown. Why are they locked up? What crime have they committed? Many of them are asylum seekers. And to seek asylum, you have to be on the U.S. soil. You can't seek ask for asylum while you're in Pakistan or China or India or Guatemala. You have to be on U.S. soil. It is not a crime to ask for asylum. Mesa Verde is also a private prison. It's run by GEO, which makes over $2 billion a year, not on Mesa Verde, but in general. In fact, it's not even the largest private prison. I think, well, maybe there's one other that's Core Civic and GEO compete to make more money. In 2017, I think GEO contracts with the U.S. government were $774 million. They have prisons throughout the world, not just in the U.S. So under this current administration, this business has thrived, of course, and stocks have soared. So that is your tax dollars going to support private corporations that are basically participating in human trafficking, in my opinion. And it not only affects asylum seekers, although there are many of those, but families with mixed status, citizen children, I met one man from Cuba who was married to a citizen, he had citizen children, he had citizen grandchildren, and he was detained at Mesa Verde because Cuba doesn't have an agreement with the U.S. to take them back. So there he sat for about 2 years. So Mesa Verde, like she said, is downtown. It's on the corner of 24th and Golden State Avenue. You maybe have seen it. Most people don't know what it is. So it opened in March 2015, and at that time I was on a listserv, and I was asked to visit a young man in detention named Kwesi. So we formed our group in honor of him. He had been there almost 2 years. He was from Ghana, escaping religious persecution, and it took an advocacy of lawyers and political activists and people to get him free. It was a big effort on the part of everybody, but he was finally freed. And at that time, several of us got involved in visiting other immigrants. And so we started Kern Welcoming and Extending Solidarity to Immigrants, or also known as Kwesi. And we are part of a national immigration visitation and advocacy network called Freedom for Immigrants. The mission is to end the isolation of immigrants that they feel in detention and to let them know that we know they're there. So they know someone is thinking about them because they often feel so isolated, they have no contact with the outside, especially those people that don't have any family here. Maybe they've come by themselves. So this lets them know that somebody cares and knows that they're there. We also advocate on their behalf. We talk to lawyers, to their families, if it's difficult for them. I know someone who used to set up a call with a immigrant's husband on her phone and a three-way conversation. And then we also support people when they're released on bond or once they've won their asylum cases. We received a small grant from Lutheran Immigrant and Refugee Services, so that helps defray costs. So if somebody gets out, we will often buy them a phone or get them some luggage. We have donations of luggage because most people don't stay in Bakersfield, the ones that we've been visiting. So we'll get them luggage and we'll get them clothes, warm coats for back east, things like that, and put together a travel package. Sometimes we house them for short periods, 1 or 2 nights, or even longer. So we have one volunteer and her husband, who's in the audience, who housed a young woman for, I think it was over 6 months. She was only 18 when she showed up, and she came from Nigeria, not knowing anyone in the country. She went to Texas, and then that didn't work out, so she came back to stay with our volunteers, and I think she refers to them as Grandma and Grandpa. if I'm not mistaken. So there are a lot of families there a lot of people there without any family in the country or nearby. So a lot of people go to Baltimore or Texas or Chicago. And the depression that they feel is immense. They often feel anxiety, depression. This same woman that I mentioned once, so she had been in detention for about 8 months, and I got her name, and so I went to visit her, and I was the first person that she'd seen in 8 months. Well, she was so depressed and losing hope that she wouldn't eat. So what did they do at Mesa Verde? They put her in isolation. Isn't that what you do with a depressed person? So they do have medical services, but you have to put in a request, and sometimes it's granted, and sometimes it isn't. And many of the women mostly I've been in contact with more women than men, and most of them have been prescribed antidepressants, but often they won't take them, and so there may be other consequences for that, like isolation. There was also a man in there who was suffering from schizophrenia, and they put him in isolation. I'm not sure what good that did. So not only is it problematic to have asylum seekers and people that are just going to work locked up for no reason, it's a money maker, but it's also the fact that this is a private prison is problematic. We don't want them making money off of people, but also there's no oversight and transparency. We cannot find out what goes on inside, as you can at a county jail or something like that. Amber has covered some of what I was going to say, so let's... There are also limited activities. So if you're in a jail, you have the right, if you're a citizen, you go to jail, you have the right to get a GED or take ESL classes or things like that, but these people have no such rights. There are no educational opportunities for them. Any activity comes from volunteer work. So some people, I think there was somebody teaching Zumba and crochet, and the family, what is it? The Alliance Against Family Violence came in and taught art therapy, and I think parenting classes, but that's a volunteer basis. So GEO refuses to contract. I teach at BC. I went and I talked to them, and I teach English for multilingual students. I said, can I come teach English here? Well, yes, but you can't be a visitor also. And they will not make a formal agreement with BC so that I could get paid. I had to do it volunteer and then not visit anybody. So I chose to visit people instead. They go outside maybe for 1 hour twice a day, if that. So depending on if there's a ruckus or something, then that privilege is often taken away as well. I think the legal representation aspect that Amber mentioned is so important. The statistics I've read is that only about 10% of asylum case seekers win their cases if they do not have legal representation, where over half win them with legal representation. And one of the rationalizations is that they won't show up to their hearings unless we detain them. That's what you'll hear, the rationale. But in fact, I think statistics I read just today is that 96% of asylum seekers show up to their hearings that are not detained. So if you let them out, they will show up. Same with families. It was like an overwhelming number, like 86% do show up for hearings. So that is, honestly, that's bogus rationale. So if you would like to get involved, we need volunteers. We especially need Spanish speakers. So what we do is we go in and we sit with the person that's in immigration. We listen to that person and provide them company, basically. That's it, for like an hour, because the visitation is for 1 hour and only twice a week. So each dorm has 2 visiting days. So we just go, we have a list of names, different people give us names of their friends that would like a visit or something, and so we just go and we talk to them and we mostly listen to them. So we also would love to have you and would like any post-release support that you could do if you want to get involved with driving someone to the bus, picking them up from the ICE office, housing someone for short-term or even long-term. A young man I met on Monday when I was there needs a sponsor. He knows nobody. He had to leave Uganda and doesn't have a soul in this country. So any way that you can volunteer would be great. We also always take donations. Thank you.
Thank you. So we are moving into the question and answer portion, and just a reminder to those in the overflow room, you can bring in cards if they haven't been collected. You can also come into the room and just grab one of the live mics. There's not a formal way that we're going to do this. You've got mics on both sides, and you can just come to either one. If it's not on, there's a switch at the top that you just push towards the microphone, part of the microphone. And if we do end up with a line, then we can just rotate back and forth between the sides. And while cards are coming in and or you want to approach it, I have the advantage of getting to ask some questions I have right now. And one is, Jeannie, is it a secured facility? So just talking about Mesa Verde right now. Could I go there tomorrow and visit people, or what's the process? Is there a clearance process? What type of background do you have?
That's a good question. So we are not a formal group. We're an informal group. Formal groups give the people in detention a list, and they have an agreement with ICE, but we don't. So what we have is a list of people that we go visit, and when we go in, we say we're that person's friend. And they can't really say, no, you're not. You didn't pronounce his name right. It's like, well, you try pronouncing that name. We'll see how you do. So we provide training about visiting, because a lot of those people in there have suffered trauma, and there are just some protocols that we want to review before people go in to visit. And then the first time that we go visit, we take a new person and an experienced person. So the people in detention can have up to 3 visitors at once. So yeah, we just go and we show up and we say we want to visit so-and-so, and then there's a lot of waiting involved.
And if you showed up without a name, someone specific.
Without a name, you can't do anything.
And you have
First and last name.
Does Mesa Verde have both adult and minor
Do they have what?
detainees?
Oh, they only have adults, no minors. And then when you go in to visit, you go through the metal detector, and you can't bring anything in. No notepads, no pencils, nothing like that. You can just go and talk. So your cell phone has to be left in the car, etc.
Okay, I'm going to ask this question. Jeannie, you commented that since Mesa Verde is a private prison, and therefore there's no oversight, and therefore no way of knowing what goes on inside, if they are supported with government funds, isn't it the responsibility of the government to provide oversight? And if so, why isn't this happening?
Well, yes, I would say it is. And I've had that same question. I think I brought it up yesterday at a meeting we had. I think ICE is a federal government entity and is their agreement with GEO. So it's like they're investigating themselves. Maybe Amber can speak.
Yeah, so essentially there are basically standards of care that ICE has to meet at these facilities, right? And you, at least in California, there was a system where the state attorney general could go into the facility and investigate and look into conditions. But that doesn't necessarily always happen, right? So then it is a self-check system where ICE is basically checking in with GEO and trying to see if they are complying with DHS's regulations, Department of Homeland Security's regulations for medical care, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah, there's not a third party
There's not a third party
investigating
overseeing.
or checking.
Is it safe for undocumented students to visit at Mesa Verde?
No. You have to give them a driver's license, and
Run a background check.
I'm sure they've done background checks. They don't require that, but as soon as they see your name written down, I'm sure they do. I would not go there if I were undocumented. And I've had friends in various stages of the immigration process decide it wasn't safe for them.
Question from the audience.
Yes, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, now I noticed that I got a two-party question, okay? First of all, what advice can you give us, those who want to help but don't speak English, don't speak Spanish, I'm sorry?
So that's me. There are plenty of people inside that do speak English. There are a lot of immigrants that have lived in the U.S. a long time, 20, 40 years, that are inside. They speak English. And then there are people from Africa, India, Brazil, Turkey, wherever, they do speak English.
Okay, and my second question is, okay, how can we as taxpaying citizens do an oversight of what's really going on? Because I tried tweeting,
That's what you can start, I think. Start the advisory council.
Okay.
Yes, that's what we need.
Yeah, because I mean, I have empathy for human being. Period. You know what I mean? Because it really touched me when you see children getting taken from their parent. You know what I mean? And the bonds, overpriced the bonds, especially silly stuff about the judge as the 2-year-old. That is ludicrous. That is unheard of. That don't even make no sense.
Right, and I think that also to add to that, I think that we have key elected officials here in our county that have a core responsibility to address that issue and have the power to address that issue. So I think going and meeting or calling your elected official, it is an important tool. And when we say come out and help and support like this campaign or this action, we mean it, right? Because I think that knocking on doors, even if the door is not open, it's important, right? We need to make sure that that happens. And it's not only at the state level, but also at the federal level.
So do we give you our email address when we leave or what?
Excuse me?
Do we give you our email address when we leave? To email us or whatever? Because, I mean, this nonsense got to stop. I'm paying serious money for taxes. And, I mean, we all are.
Yeah.
And I don't think any of us here believe and not have empathy for these people. You know, they're human beings, you know.
And we need people like you to speak on it, right?
And I will speak on
They
it.
hear it from us, and they're already tired of hearing it from us. We
Well,
need
I
people
will speak on
that
it,
are
trust
involved. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Hello, my name is Yoseline Aguilar. I am here. I'm a student here at CCB, and I just have more of a statement, not really a question, but it's more about how there's on the flyer it says the perspectives of an activist, attorney, and an education person, but the perspective of an actual person that's in an immigration detention facility is also just as valuable.
Yes.
So I definitely
Yes.
think that undocumented people are supposed to be leading these conversations and leading the movement and leading the fight for their liberation. So that's just something that I just wanted to put out there.
Yeah.
And I know you guys have good intentions and stuff, but again, I really do believe that undocumented people are supposed to be leading this. So that's it. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that.
Do you
Can't argue with that.
have any insight
Yeah.
to what will happen to Mesa Verde since the city of McFarland decided to pull out of their agreement to run the facility in Bakersfield? Can they get around SB 29 or Dignity, Not Detention Act?
Okay. So I thank you for that question and for knowing that there is a piece of legislation that actually has an impact on that contract. So there were initial rumors, right, that were later confirmed that the city of McFarland decided to terminate their contract with Geo Group to keep the Mesa Verde facility running, right? So government contracts, when they operate with detention facilities, the law provides, I believe, 2 routes to be able to operate a facility. One is that you operate through a local government agency, a local city, a third party, right, to contract with. So McFarland was that third party involved in that. So when they pulled out, now they are now under California legislation. It basically is saying that no new contracts can be formed with local agencies, like, right? So California is not going to allow, let's say, Bakersfield City to contract with Geo to keep this facility running. So when they decided to pull that contract, Geo Group is now left in what we thought probably could be a limbo stage, right? Do they open? Do they keep open? Do they find a way to stay open? Or do they close? And if they close, what does that mean for the 400 individuals that are detained? We saw in Northern County, in Contra Costa County, a facility that similarly closed. And what happened to those individuals is they were sent to different holding facilities, right? So the issue did not get resolved. The issue moved to another place, right? Because ICE is not going to say, okay, you closed, so now we're going to let you go, right? We're going to let you be free. So we had people that maybe made it to Washington, to Colorado, to Hawaii. You know, I don't know about you guys, but I mean, taking a 5-hour, 6-hour flight to Hawaii to go visit a family member is just not going to happen, right? So when you think about potentially that some of those people did have access to counsel, and now that they got shifted, right, maybe their counsel's just not able to represent them in Colorado if they were in California. So we don't have clear instructions as to what's going to happen, whether indeed it's going to remain open or if it's going to close. We have not heard anything from the detainees of any rumors. Usually they are intel into what's happening, right, and what they're hearing. But I think some of the conversations have gone into there probably is something in the works, right? Like Geo might not necessarily close, but we don't know. So advocates were preparing for it.
Are UFW and or Kuisi taking any steps to kind of facilitate or help close down Mesa Verde?
To close down Mesa Verde? From the UFW Foundation's perspective, we're concerned about people who are represented and making sure that they can have continued representation. But for those that are not represented, right, we want to make sure that they don't get lost in the shuffle or in the movement. So the UFW Foundation does monthly intakes at Mesa Verde, and through that data, we're trying to hopefully screen as many people as we can to make sure that we have their information to later be able to track them down. I think that there is more to, saying yes, this facility should close or it shouldn't close. But I think our priority is making sure that people's rights are considered and are not violated in the process.
And I think as part of Freedom for Immigrants, we're in favor of abolishing all detention centers. But in terms of, it's a complicated issue, and so what I think our preference would be to be able to raise the bonds of those that are there if they close so that they could be released instead of transferred and, as Amber said, getting lost somewhere else in the country.
Audience question. Do you have a question?
Oh, hi. I'm Professor Gonzalo Santos, known to being involved on the issue of immigration for the last 20 years here in Bakersfield. I also teach the historical sociology of immigration. For me, it's a very clear position that we should close down every single detention center for profit in the United States. Now, I want to add something to the admirable presentation of Dr. Sawyer when he went over the torrid history of separation of families and detention of families going back to Native Americans, and he spoke of other cases. But I want to make sure people understand the correct historical context of today's problem. It doesn't originate in the 19th century. It doesn't even originate in the first half of the 20th century. When we were having the Cold War in the middle of the 20th century all the way to the 1990s, the number of people detained in federal facilities for immigration infractions was negligible, zero for all practical purposes. For one thing, because it was a lot cheaper for the immigration authorities to promptly deport, summarily deport Mexicans across the border than to pay for federal prisons to detain them. Also because the number of crimes that mandated legally the deportation of immigrants was very few and very strict. I came in 1970 as an immigrant. One of the first things I learned as an activist in the middle of the Vietnam War was I can do everything an American citizen could do, including civil disobedience, and not get deported. When I discovered that, I promptly got arrested. All right? I have been involved in every conceivable way as an immigrant in the struggles for justice of this country without ever fearing getting deported. Never. Because the law was on my side. I remember Ted Kennedy supporting Vietnamese students that were here in the 1970s speaking against the war. And when the Nixon administration tried to deport them, they promptly organized congressional hearings, and those students had to be retained in the United States because there were instances of students that had been taken back to Vietnam and shot on the airport. Same thing happened with the Iranian students after the overthrow of the Shah. So we have a long history of being protected by the law as immigrants to engage in even minor infractions, even felonies, even making jail time, paying for our infractions to society, coming out and being reintegrated to society without fear of deportation, because that requires such a high bar. You have to have crimes of moral turpitude, treason, spying, murder, something like that. All right? Now, so let's put it in context. What happened after the Cold War ended, and we had been accusing a finger to the totalitarian regime that locked up people in the Soviet gulag, suddenly we developed our own gulag. It happened in the name of combating terrorism. It happened in 1996. It happened under a Democratic Party president called Bill Clinton. He signed, he didn't come up with these laws, he merely signed them to his infinite discredit. The Republicans pushed it and he signed it, that enlarged the list of misdemeanors and crimes and infractions and immigration issues, administrative civil immigration, that mandated deportation without appeal. And that has been a Damocles sword on the necks of 55 million immigrants ever since in this country, since 1996. At the same time they passed that law, enlarging the list of possible infractions to make people deportable, it mandated incarcerating a large number of people too, especially returned migrants without authority. And then, to make matters worse, they permitted for the first time in American history for-profit prisons. And that was part of the times, the 1990s. Hillary Clinton apologized for the domestic use of prisons for mass incarceration for profit, but she did not say a word about the incarceration of immigrants for profit. All right? That began then in 1996. Since then, it has ballooned, and it is now the American gulag. So the gentleman, the good gentleman that spoke before me, he's back there. Mister, you said, what can we do as taxpayers? Okay, I'm going to answer that question. We have to get rid of those laws. How do we get rid of those laws? Since 1996, we elect better people to Congress. As long as we keep re-electing the weasels and rascals we now have, how are we going to change those laws? They are in the pocket of the prison industrial complex that is making billions of dollars off the back of our people. So wake up, get to vote, throw him out, and get people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Imagine that.
Thank you. Do we have any children detention? Where's the nearest children detention center?
I think Texas, there are three, or for family detention, there are three.
For family detention, but in children detention in California, we have some in Orange County. That is, we have about, I think, 3 in Orange County, 1 in Riverside County, and then some in at the border, San Diego County. So those do exist.
And I understand that the majority, well, more of the children detention centers or family detention centers are operated by nonprofits versus for-profits. Is that
yes,
accurate?
That is correct. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it's mixed. I don't think we have all the information, right?
Right. And I mean, essentially, and I say yes because I did do removal defense for unaccompanied children, and I had often had to go visit them at those facilities. And in essence, those facilities' addresses are private information. They're confidential information to safeguard the safety of those children. But they are mostly run by nonprofit organizations that contract them with the Department of Human Services to provide that.
Even of the nonprofits, are they, and this might exceed, because we don't have one locally, your level of knowledge, but are they, and I'm getting to one of the card questions, but do the nonprofits exceed the DHS guidelines because they're a nonprofit, or are they still kind of operating on a for-profit level as far as you know?
What do you know about that?
Yeah, so, you know, what Dr. Sawyer described, like, yes, they do have to go to class, they do have classroom settings, the resources that they need, but I think just with any nonprofit, right, they lack sufficient resources, right? There's so many children, there's an array of services that they have to provide. They have to provide food, shelter, and education, healthcare. So there is a system to make sure that they access those resources. But there are many, many children that get stuck in that process, right? Maybe there's a lack of social workers to guide them through that process. Maybe there's, you know, the psychologist that came in last week is no longer available, or just, you know, so there are standards. And I would say, to give them the benefit of the doubt, that I think those are just minimum standards. And then I think for the most part, they are met.
With the private prison company, they claim better living conditions. Do you feel that they are truly offering a good living place, or is it purely based on profit? So for the for-profit detention centers, are they? So the question is, they claim better living conditions. Do you feel that they are truly offering a good living place for the detainees?
So it's hard for me to say. I don't believe in detention at all. So, but I think that there are some places that run better than others. Like Adelanto is infamous. There are people with nooses and suicides and terrible things. Mesa Verde, the people that I've talked to have come from such horrendous conditions and been in prison elsewhere, that they won't say anything negative about Mesa Verde. Now, I goad them. I'm like, well, how's the food? Are you cold in your dorm? Are you hot? Everything is fine. Everything is fine. So they're so grateful to be out of their perilous place that I don't know.
Dr. Sawyer, one of the interesting interplays that I'm curious about is there's been a lot of progress on international law, right? Human rights law, that children are not supposed to be in secure detention facility. They're not supposed to be shackled. You're supposed to avoid that. Is that is the U.S. behind on the immigration and detention of minors with respect to international law? And I don't expect you to have necessarily like an actual formal answer, but from your observations and what you've looked into, what's the interplay between international law and our own immigration and detention?
I think on the rights of migrants in general, we are behind the curve according to universal standards, right? Because there is a guarantee of movement and the seeking of asylum, and the right to seek asylum. And we've seen with the issue of the caravans recently, and keeping the caravans within Mexico and denying that access to seek asylum in the regular way. I mean, that's just one of numerous examples of where we are quite behind. I mean, we do have the Flores settlement, right, that has the limitation on how long the families can be contained, right, together, right, the 20 days. And that is something that with Obama had to back off to some extent on the family detainment when that began in that time. Yeah.
Audience question?
It's actually a comment. So I immigrated to this country in, my parents tell me it was 1979. I was 2 years old. I am now an American citizen. I became an American citizen at 21. And I also teach on this campus. And I teach at our local community college. And I have also taught at a private institution, a correctional facility. In fact, it was GEO. I taught at McFarland in 2014 while I was still teaching at night for Bakersfield College. I was the ABE instructor, the Adult Basic Education instructor. And I'd have to say that embarrassingly, I honestly was not very educated and aware about a lot of the issues that were at hand. I was looking for a job. And I was looking for a job that I was passionate about. And that was working in a prison and being a source of help. And that's exactly what I did. I provided a service, and I worked with individuals, the females in McFarland, who were, many of them, I had an ESL class, who actually probably 90% of my class were illegal immigrants, and they were waiting until their term finished, and then they would be deported. And what I found was, in working with my students, was that the cases that were, or the reasons why they were incarcerated, because of the way the law was written, they were oftentimes paying for kind of the association, right? They were paying for somebody else's crime. They were present during a crime, but they didn't commit the crime. And unfortunately, one of my students who actually came from Chowchilla, she was in Chowchilla for about 10 years. And she was finishing up her term with McFarland, or in McFarland. If she would have fought her case any further in terms of her immigration status and her children were here in the United States, she would have to be in a detention center longer, and which meant that she had to be held longer, obviously. She couldn't afford an attorney, and in the 10 years that she was in Chowchilla, she never went to class. She was never obligated to go to class, so she worked. When she came to McFarland, honestly, what I saw there at the private prison, I honestly saw a lot of great things happening. I saw a lot of research-based practices. There were a lot of people that were there truly trying to help individuals. And I am one of them. It's actually a little bit sentimental for me because the day that she left, I was actually leaving McFarland and taking a full-term position at the college for a semester. And we're not supposed to touch each other, right? But whenever we have little graduations, we would give each other hugs and whatnot. And I went to go visit her in her dorm, and she gave me a hug. And she said I was the best thing that ever happened to her in the 13 years that she was down, because in my class, she learned how to read and how to write. And I was totally, and I kind of knew that already, but that was completely shocking to me that in 10 years she didn't go to school. And so that was pretty impacting. She's just an amazing individual and very intelligent woman. And now she was going to go back to Mexico to live her life free. She knew that she couldn't stay here. Whether she did legally, I don't know, and it doesn't matter to me. But she knew that she had to go back to her country. So she didn't fight her case. And so in terms of private facilities, I know that there, and I appreciate Dr. Santos. I've met Dr. Santos a long time ago, and I think we should all take your course to really understand these issues at a greater level. However, I think if anything, being inside the prison, getting a job and helping individuals is, for me, the least that I can do to try to give back. And at the same time, obviously it was a job for me, but at the same time I was providing a service. And I'm not definitely advocating detention by any means. However, it definitely opened my eyes. I currently now teach through the Inmate Scholars Program, and I think it was that experience that really helped me see, okay, as an educator, what can I do? What can I continue to do with the limitations that I have? And that is to continue to give back and go into the institutions and provide this service, because it is so needed. And the inmates, the people that are incarcerated, are hungry for education. They're hungry to, in that small, and for the men, it's different. The men in Delano are incarcerated in cells, whereas Gio's facility, because they're looking at transforming incarceration, they have dorms, and that supposedly gives them more freedom, but honestly, it's actually, if you've been incarcerated for a long time, you don't know how to trust people, and to just basically share your housing and be open is actually very frightening for people, because now you have less protection. So there was a lot of factors. There's a lot of factors, a lot of layers here, and I think there's just chipping away and seeing what we can do individually to help this case, and definitely education, writing policy, writing to our legislatures, absolutely, definitely important. I just thought I'd share that with you all.
Thank you. That actually leads right into another question, because it's been raised in different perspectives. But an audience question is, what about DACA people? What can we do to help? Any thoughts on that?
I'll take a deep breath.
Yeah.
I think overall, there has been so much discussion, right, at the federal level to make sure that there is a legislation that makes sure to provide them a pathway to citizenship. And I think it's important to continue to push for that conversation, but not only having a conversation about it, but acting on it, right? So again, when Dr. Santos said, let's go get rid of some people, right? I mean, maybe that's what it takes, right? Maybe it takes making sure that we are acting and engaging as voters, as eligible voters, and even we see these DACA recipients, these dreamers that people call them, they themselves are driving other people to make sure that they're voting, right? So I mean, if we're not inspired by their story, if we're not inspired by how committed they are to this nation and to making sure that the laws are followed, then I think that we have to sort of consider to ourselves, like, well, what really are we doing, right? And I think that there are platforms out there to make sure that we are getting involved in pushing that legislation and making sure that it's a legislation that is comprehensive and not necessarily something that is going to provide, I say, like a treat. You know, this is not a treat. This is not something that needs to be get citizenship at the expense of others, right? So making sure that we're out there voting, making sure that we're calling our elected officials, that we're engaging in that practice is very, very important.
Yeah, and I just want to commend the young woman who spoke earlier about the importance of that voice, you know, undocumented students advocating on behalf of their own, on this issue, right? Taking leadership in that and self-advocating, having that courage to advocate, and those of us, you know, supporting you as best we can in that. So I really want to commend you for that comment. And I think as educators, I think there is the policy dimension, and obviously it does come to changing laws, bringing out practices to the light of day. But in the meantime, with our DACA students, it's just supporting them as educators to move to that next step, right? There's so much uncertainty. There's so many things that we can't control, but there are things we can, and there's the resources we can give to keep moving our young people forward to the next thing, right? And that's the best we can do while also, committing to all the other actions we've heard here today. But yeah, take that leadership. Show us the way, yeah.
Audience question.
Thank you, panelists, for coming tonight to help us discuss a controversial issue that is pertaining to our community. I'd like to ask you, and
Jeannie.
Thank you.
Jeannie.
Thank you. Claim that the for-profit prisons have no oversight. If we were to get rid of those and have public prisons instead, would that solve any problems?
Well, I think that might be better for the oversight, but I still don't believe in throwing immigrants in prison. That's it.
Mm-hmm. And
Would it be better? It would be better. The public prison would be better. I've had people tell me they've been moved from Contra Costa County Jail or somewhere else where they were housed together with citizens. And although they thought it was weird that this country will put an asylum seeker in with a drug dealer and other criminals, they appreciated the GED classes. I knew Kwesi himself. He took ESL, and then he earned his GED while he was in Contra Costa, and he came here, and he laid in bed all day. So that's one benefit. But, why? There are community monitoring, like community accompaniment for immigrants, programs where the immigrant is released without any detention, and the community member ensures that that person will show up at their hearing. That's basically the only thing the government really wants. But the corporations want to make money. So they can release these people, have community monitoring, put an ankle monitor on for $5 a day or something like that, then we don't need them in any prisons.
Thank you. And I just wanted to follow up on your question too. I think is it in fact better? To me, it's not, right? I mean, it's not necessarily better to have maybe a public institution still detaining people. The better would be that people are not detained. The better would be that people are not having to be criminalized for something that it's not criminal at all, right? So then the issue there is that, like Jeannie said, right, there are alternatives to detention, and that is prescribed by the law. Right, so I think that we need, as advocates, legal advocates, and community members need to make sure that we're pushing and making sure that those laws are followed.
And I'll add to that, just the comment and the question are based on the previous statement that there is no oversight. There is oversight. It's not adequate oversight, I would say, but One, the government has recognized the lack of oversight, and the OIG, the Office of Inspector General, has been tasked with kind of overseeing the DHS's guidelines and making sure that enforcement is being met, or that those guidelines are being met. I'm not saying that it's adequate, but at least there is some sense of an oversight obligation. And most importantly, the OIG report that was just issued last month in January identified specifically the lack of oversight, which is the first step in actually creating it. And not lack of, but the lack of ensuring that the guidelines were being enforced. So there's some movement in the right direction, at least with the both for-profit and non-profit detention centers. Do you have a question? Okay.
Okay, so I have a question for Amber Tovar. So you had said that there's about 400 people in Mesa Verde, right? And you had said that a lot of them can't afford to have legal representation when they go to San Francisco or something. And then you also said that it wouldn't be the best idea to shut it down just because of the fact that if they were to be transferred out, they won't have legal representation. So that just kind of confused me. And it also sounded like the excuse that the ACLU used when they said that they don't support in the shutting down of Mesa Verde because of the family members that would be transferred or lost, when in reality the people in Mesa Verde aren't even from Kern County. They are from other places, specifically the Bay Area, Oakland area. So it's just, I'm just confused on that part, and whether if it were to be shut down, can't they legally fight their case outside of Mesa Verde? Maybe get out on bond or have an ankle monitor, or what could really happen, because this detention center really needs to go.
Right, and thank you so much for that question. I think it's not necessarily that I'm advocating that Mesa Verde should not close or should close. I think what I'm saying is that there are other factors that I think we need to consider and be prepared to address that issue for either decision, right? So then what I mean by people not having access to representation is that what happened with Contra Costa County is that there were people that moved outside of our jurisdiction, right? And what I mean by that is, I think that California is lucky in the sense that we are in the Ninth Circuit, right? We're what we call immigrant-friendly circuits, right? So that if they were to move to another circuit where there definitely are no bond hearings, there definitely, the way that asylum laws are interpreted are not in the best way. That we have to consider also that even though having somebody detained is not the best situation, if they have been linked to counsel here and that they are at risk of losing counsel, but more so losing their case and being deported to a country where they are certainly to be killed, that those are some of the factors that I think we should consider. And then find ways to make sure that that need is met, right? So I think that it's such a sensitive topic, right? And when you say like we need to make sure that the community's voice is being raised and that the community themselves are speaking, I think that's been our practice, where we're hoping to make sure that we're meeting with folks both inside detention, outside of detention, that we, tell us, right? How can we help you? What would be the best alternative? Not that there is a best alternative, right? But it's a sensitive issue, we'll say that, and that as a legal advocate, but also as a community member, I'm torn, right? I'm torn between like, this is not right, but also if my client leaves, my client is gonna lose her case, right? So I think that's where that comes from, right?
Okay, thank you.
There was a comment earlier on these are our taxpayer dollars, right? It's interesting, the average cost, my understanding, for a detained adult is $100 a day. Ankle monitors would be $11 a day. Question?
I'm Gwyneth Soto, and I have two questions for you guys, but if one's preferred, that's okay. So my question is, who specifically is profiting from this? Who owns the prisons or the detainee centers?
Who's profiting? Who's profiting from the prisons?
Who's profiting?
Who's profiting?
The corporations, geo, yeah.
Okay, so my second question is, I looked on the site of the detainee center, and one of the comments were, GEO is an immigrant prison that profits off caging women and families. They verbally and emotionally abuse the people detained. They block all the Spanish channels on the TVs and block any news about immigration. They purposely bring families from the North Cal and South Cal here so they won't have a fighting chance in their cases. We as people, what could we do about this? When people are seeing that they've been verbally abused there, and there is other comments supporting that, so it probably isn't made up.
If I can answer that question, I think part of what's so wonderful about Coesti is that they have access to a number of people who are basically signing up on a wait list to talk to them, right? And I think the gathering of these stories is so, so important. For legal advocates, for attorneys, I leave that to the litigators. I don't consider myself a litigator, right? I mean, that there are opportunities to make sure that that does not happen. But we can't have proof of that if we just don't get these stories. So that story that you shared, I think it's a great example of something that can be documented, tracked, recognize patterns that could potentially help. I know somebody mentioned the ACLU. They are specifically involved in that process, making sure that human rights are not violated, right? Freedom for Immigrants is also advocating to make sure that those rights are not violated. So I think that's a perfect example of just what you did right there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Question.
And for the young woman who just spoke, you should look online for Freedom for Immigrants as well as a place to become active and continue your good work. So I think that in Kern County, we're in this really interesting moment with this awareness that this contract has ended and what's going to happen. And I think it's really important that locally we keep raising this point that seeking asylum is not a crime, that people are being imprisoned and they haven't committed a crime.
Yeah.
Right? And so working on that narrative, and as we're, on the one hand we've got, well, which kind of prison would be better? When, this discussion of what's the government's stake in this is having people show up for their hearing. And so is this a time that community activism could help shift that for something much more, at least much more humane, right? This idea of here's an ankle monitor, it's a lot less burdensome as taxpayers, right? And when the economic argument needs to be made, I think we need to be making that argument loudly and over and over and over here and now because we might have this opportunity. And I was wondering if you know if we're getting that organizing going or how to do that, or if that is within the realm of possibility.
Yeah, so locally we do have a group. Different organizations have created what's currently called the Rapid Response Network of Kern. It's a collaborative of different organizations that are essentially tackling this issue, right? And trying to address not only rapid response efforts, and by rapid response we mean ICE enforcement, but also some of the other issues around immigration, around removal proceedings, around removal defense. So I think there's an opportunity to get involved. I think that we need leaders, right? Leaders that are willing to have these tough conversations and who want to contribute, who want to support and help guide us in the right direction. So I invite you, to come and join us, to come and have those discussions, to help us lead that conversation. I think sometimes we maybe look to these organizations to carry the way, but just how that young lady said, I mean, we have voices of people who are directly impacted by that, and I think locally we're making headway, I would want to say, with local elected officials, and I think that is thanks to the support of the community. Not so long ago in December, we had a truth forum, and I think that was the first time that essentially the County Board of Supervisors was listening to these immigration issues, right? Specifically about ICE enforcement and the collaboration between the County Sheriff's Office and ICE, right? So it's definitely pushing the agenda to make sure that we're having these conversations. And like I said, we need the support of people, making sure that they don't hear it from me, that they don't hear it from Jeannie, that they hear it from people and saying, like, we do not support this. The backlash that we get when we go and talk to elected officials is like, well, my constituents don't support what you're saying, right? But little do they know. I mean, there's a room full of people who were definitely interested in this issue. They need to see you, they need to know you, and need to know exactly what you think.
In interest of time, I'm just going to ask that we keep the questions pretty concise and the answers pretty concise, so we can give everyone an opportunity to ask a question if they want to. Go ahead.
I just wanted to go, when a young man came up and asked about the prison, private versus for profit. And I've talked to a number of people that have been incarcerated at Mesa Verde, and two in particular that spent time in prison as well as in the detention center. And one of the things that they said was, in a regular prison, they had a job. They had an opportunity to get up, have breakfast, go to work, have lunch, get off work, maybe watch a little TV, maybe spend a little time with their bunkmate and go to bed. The days went fast. In Mesa Verde, there's 300 men with bunks in there. It's one huge dorm, and you got to be, if you've been in prison, you got to protect yourself, and you're not going to be able to get too friendly with a lot of different people because of the situations. Great deal of people in there are just asylum seekers. There are some people that are not the best people that have been picked up for a reason too, but the majority of people that came there are looking for a chance for freedom. And if there's people in there for over 2 years, and in that kind of a circumstance, mental health is going to go down quickly because you'll see people just spending the whole day in their bed. It's a terrible situation, and it's something that we need to know as individuals that this is in our backyard that's going on, and speaking up, visiting, talking to them. And the other thing I will say is there's a small group of young men that I've met, about 7 to 8 of them, that have a Bible study. And one of them, every single time I talk to him, he has a smile on his face, and they help each other, and they're able to do that. But one of the people in there just gave up because another 6 months, another trial comes up, another one. And you can't handle that for years and years. And so they leave and go get deported back to Guatemala or wherever it is, and it's not a good situation. So freedom is a huge thing that we need to be concerned about. Freedom just to be able to do the best you can, even in that circumstance.
Thank you.
Okay, I just have a quick statement and a clarification of a question I had asked earlier. I just really want to thank you guys for coming out and actually speaking about this, especially being like there's a lot of like the white community here, like in this Hispanic community, there's this big schema that it's the natives versus us, and seeing so many races come together on this issue that really frightens like immigrants, it's really beautiful, and thank you everybody for being here for that. And then the question for the DACA was, not like legislative, what can immigrants do to help right now? Not just for legislative, like as far as, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, how can we help you help them? What can we do as far as like resources? What can we give you? What can we do that doesn't involve much legality from our part? Because right now we just kind of feel useless because we can't do anything and we want to do more.
So, if people don't feel comfortable going into the detention facility, they can help us with when people get out. So people do get released on bond, or they win their asylum cases. And for example, 2 weeks ago, I think, like I got texts from attorneys in the Bay Area saying, "Oh, Jeannie, can you help these people? Like 3 people are getting out today," and they were. One day, I think one of them spoke English. So I'm trying to get this guy to the train, speaking some terrible, few Spanish words. But those situations, I always call on the Spanish speakers that I know, even and I don't want to call in the same people all the time because they have jobs and they're young people and they have lives. And so any way that someone could help after someone gets out, housing for a couple nights or one night, or helping them get on their way, or translating would be great. If you do feel comfortable going in and you speak Spanish, that is really, that would really be helpful.
And someone as a DACA recipient can't do something like that?
So
or?
a DACA student can come with me or can go pick someone else up. You don't have to, they're released like on the street, often at 800 Truxton, and they, then you can go pick them up and take them to the train station. We have one DACA, she's not a student anymore, but she's one of our key people in our group. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We, just for a purpose of time and keeping it to 8 o'clock, I'm just going to make a few concluding comments, and then we're going to wrap it up with the hope that the panelists will stick around for a couple of minutes so those that still have some questions can have the opportunity to ask the panelists. And just so that you know some of the other audience questions that came in, how can children who are held in migrant holding centers represent themselves? So questions about how they can, one, pay for bond, how can they represent themselves? The interplay between human trafficking and the detention centers, the William Wilbur Forrest Human Trafficking Reauthorization Act, and if ICE is deemed immoral or abolished, what solutions are there to ensure that children are not exploited in forced labor, trafficking, smuggling of drugs, or prostitution? And then someone had a question about what is the visa process like? How long does it take? Who would be a good person to answer visa questions?
I can answer that.
Okay, and I know some of you have questions, and I do encourage you to ask the panelists the questions. But for the sake of concluding on time, I want to reiterate the thanks that Dr. Burrows mentioned at the beginning to all those that are sponsors, the Kegley Institute and the Pre-Law Society. But most importantly, I want to thank the panelists for their time and their expertise and their sharing. Thank you very much.
So, I mean, I know Coesi already made their pitch for help, but I also do want to encourage those of you who maybe think that this, yes, the legal component is very, very complicated, but there are things that volunteers can help us as well, right? I mean, the UFW Foundation is trying to start a pro se model, right? Because specifically to tackle that need, because a lot of people are not able to represent themselves or go with, they're not able to go to court with an attorney, that they can then, that we can guide them through the process to represent themselves. So, right, so then often requires helping them fill out forms, helping them translate letters, helping them put together their evidence packets. So if you are interested in that, please feel free to reach out to me. We're hoping to kick off that model in the next few months.
Once again, we welcome immigrants, and we welcome people to help end their isolation in Mesa Verde as long as it's there. So that's our goal, is to, while it's still here, whether it closes down or not, we want to make sure that those people do not feel alone. So thank you.
Okay, feel free to ask questions informally. So officially we are open.
So when I saw you up front, and I saw you nodding and smiling.
Thank you.